Well, thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, this is the first commercialization talk series of 2021, and we've decided to open it up to more groups and researchers and people outside CARES, as well as the new people inside CARES. So I'm really excited. I think there'll be a lot of very interesting discussions. Let me just share my slides. So the title of my talk today is The Science to Startup Ecosystem of Singapore. And I've added this, caveat saying it's from my perspective, so it's a researcher's perspective. It's not something that I've really taken any formal coursework on, but I think it's something that, it's an idea and something I've learned about in some discussions and programs that I think is helpful for researchers to know about. So just to briefly introduce the talks, why we're really having these is to support researchers, in particular to commercialize their work. Going from someone in the lab to someone in a suit is sometimes confusing, and there's a lot of jargon and sort of inner knowledge within both spheres, probably, that both parties don't know too much about. So being able to bridge this gap, helping researchers learn more about the other sphere of commercialization is very helpful. And I think, also to do that, forming communities and networks are also very important because, a lot of these challenges aren't discussed in a formal or informal setting. So it's hard for, people who are scientists to get this kind of knowledge. So one way to help build this knowledge is to form a network of it, so we can all sort of share intelligence with each other. And the way I'd like to do this is through more of an informal environment. In Cambridge and in CARES, we had this tradition of tea breaks, which have pretty much ended since the COVID pandemic. But I thought that these were great opportunities to meet colleagues and discuss things, whether they're in commercialization or not. And I want it to be a very informal environment because, like I said, researchers, we're not necessarily skilled in commercialization, so it's an unfamiliar territory. So what I'd like to emphasize is that this is not a typical seminar series, and we will be focusing more on having discussions and possibly workshops so that people can play a more active role in them. So generally the format of these talks are like a 15, 20 minute talk or 30-minute talk sometimes, followed by a discussion. And if there's a lot of people like there is today, we can break out into rooms because I think that's probably a better way to have conversations on Zoom rather than just have one person talking and 30 people listening. So we started this last year, last August perhaps. And we've had a series of talks, mostly from CARES researchers, but we've also started inviting in some other companies in Singapore to discuss, everything from lasers to organs on a chip. So basically, people have had this experience of bringing new science to industrial use. So our plan is to, invite both researchers and people who are experienced in bringing research to commercial application to talk and share. And these talks, the talk topics are really, how do I say, they're flexible. So usually we react to the questions that have been asked in previous talks to invite new speakers. So last year, for example, there are a lot of talks on how to get funding. So we focused a lot on, let's say, making project proposals and, different funding sources. And we introduced in the CARES intranet some resources on how to, let's say, prepare a proposal or the different resources for funding that you can address. So yeah, so if you would like to see a talk, or if you would like to give a talk, please message me, myself, or me, Luis, or Zhen, if you would like to give a talk, or if you know anyone that would like to give a talk. So, you know, Singapore is an interesting place, I think, to bring science to the industrial world. And this is pretty much because it's shaped by its environment. As we know, it's a Southeast Asian city-state. It's quite small in population compared to the rest of the world. In addition to that, it's modernized very quickly in the past 50 years, and it's multicultural. So I believe that these set up, I don't want to call them constraints, but I want to call, they set up sort of the environment that the ecosystem develops in. And it's important to take into account these factors when you start comparing Singapore, let's say, to the UK or the US or China or any of the other places, you know, that we see startups emerging and new companies emerging and we compare ourselves against. We have to sort of be cognizant of the fact that we are in a different environment. So, you know, these conditions are different. And we have to be cognizant of that. So my experience in Singapore so far, I lived in Singapore for 4 years. I did my PhD with Cambridge, as Luis mentioned, and part of that was doing research at CARES for a couple of years. So I was based in Singapore. And then I transitioned into a research fellowship role at CARES, which is another 2 years, and in which part I took part in a Smart Innovation Center grant. So this was a POC, a proof of concept, that basically enabled me to sort of explore this area of commercialization even more. So that, you know, it's my experience, this is that I'm sort of inputting into this talk that you're hearing today. And sort of the culmination of all of this is the foundation of this company, Accelerated Materials, which I'll discuss more, which, you know, it's based in the UK currently, but we also having plans for starting things in Singapore as well. So why are ecosystems important? So there's a lot of literature out there on what an ecosystem is and how to produce it, but it's basically, you know, the culmination of different actors and different environments, and basically a history in a region that basically support the formation of startups or push science to you know, reality. So you can look at all these different factors. This is a model produced by Eisenberg, and I think it's been a pretty influential model in policymaking. And you know, he basically says that you need all these different factors for a fruitful commercialization ecosystem. So you need markets that are well distributed. You need you know, governments that have policy that supports startups. You need a financial ecosystem that can fund them. Culture is also a factor, which is important. So you need a culture of entrepreneurship if you're talking about startups. And yeah, you know, it takes into account all these different factors that sort of boost up the ability of you know, startups to form. So this is a very general picture, but I would like to state that in my experience, I found that when you look at a particular case, so particular technology, the ecosystem is specific. So you can't just look at a country and say, oh, it has all these very, you know, these different factors, they're well supported, therefore it must be a good place to start this company. I think it's a very specific, you know, when you're exploring ecosystem, you have to start being very specific about what that ecosystem looks like around that technology. And this is something that we need to educate researchers on how to do, because like I said, it's a completely different world for us, and it's not as intuitive as it might be for someone who's been a business development manager for years. And, I think there's also, for policymakers, they see, boosting policy as the most important step for creating entrepreneurship and for getting technology out there. But ultimately, it's up to us, it's up to individuals to really push technology forward. It's not just culture or policy, it's really up to you. And it's up to you to take advantage of the opportunities that you see and actually find those opportunities as well. So I believe that if we teach researchers on how to analyze an ecosystem and how to explore it, then we'll be better set to take advantage of these different factors. So what's been my journey so far? So I started out as a PhD student at Cambridge, like I said. This is in 2015. And I invented a reactor basically for nanomaterial synthesis. So the advantage of this reactor was that it was continuous and it was high shear, and you could do all sorts of interesting material synthesis in it. After we filed the patent, they told us, you should develop the applications of this, see what you can do with it. So we did a lot of different case studies in the material space. And I know not all of your material science, but these are just some of the different materials we can synthesize. And we started this TS-EMO is an optimization algorithm. So we started also simultaneously thinking about how to integrate machine learning. This is with an algorithm basically to optimize our materials. And so for the past couple years, like I said, I was doing a POC project. This was funded by the this is the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology. So it's a sort of an innovation center within CREATE. So our goal of this was to use machine learning and use the reactor to produce antibacterial zinc oxide at a rate of 1 kilo per day. And the goal of this was to do it as quickly as possible. And in that effort, we also generated commercial interest, talked to different people, went to conferences, entrepreneur camps, and we also created new technology. And now we formed the company Accelerated Materials. This is a nanomanufacturing platform for all sorts of products, but for now we're focusing on low-cost functional paint additives, as well as scale-up services for people wanting to sort of rapidly produce and scale new materials. So the first business model that we came up with, this was at the very beginning, was to have an R&D service. So this is something we presented at a conference. Basically, you would provide a service to companies that do manufacturing materials or products, where we do short campaigns to develop a material. And then after that, we either license the IP, or we go through the JV to produce the product, or the company would just buy the IP outright. And so that was sort of our first envisioned business model, which sort of made sense because we know R&D, we like R&D, we had different relationships with industry through an academic setting that had sometimes resulted in licensing. So this was not an unimaginable concept, and as well, it was sort of a low capital sort of thing to do, because you don't need to buy a factory to do an R&D service. You can basically hire out some labs to do that. So how did I start exploring the ecosystem? Well, first you start as a PhD student. Obviously, the next step is to approach your internal contacts. So through CARES staff, we contacted Intuitive. This is the CARES Technology Transfer Office. So they're basically responsible for helping you file IP and also make industry contacts. In turn, after that, they gave us some advice on what to do next. They connected us with some different funding agencies, both in the government and universities, as well as research collaborators. So that was mostly actually through my supervisor, Alexei Latkin. From there, we found a project that we could be able to do, and funding source. And we got the funding to do this project. And then it was a point of, we need to find industrial partners, right? And the way we got industrial partners, was through conferences, the contacts of colleagues, cold calls or cold emails. Also, we did. I mean, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And we continued interacting with the Intuitive, and also with IRPBB. So this is the basically a branch of CARES that does business plan or business model development for sustainability. And at the end, when we had sort of sorted out our business model and our business, started formulating our business plan, that's when we started addressing the supply chain, who the end users are, the distribution network, and who's going to adopt it, as well as starting to talk with some private funds. And at this point, you can actually start to utilize the contacts you've made previously through the potential customers or research collaborators to address this larger external network. And this is just a very basic map of basically how I'm grouping these contacts. So it's the research institutes, of course, which Cambridge exists in, as well as A-STAR. There's industry, let's say BASF, these MNCs, as well as local SMEs in Singapore. The government obviously has a very important role in all of this, and as regulators, they also have a lot of programs for incubation and funding bodies for commercialization, as well as investors. And it was only until we started talking to people in industry that we noticed several key gaps. The first gap we noticed is that potential customers have their main R&D overseas. And so this could be problematic because when we would talk with people in Singapore, they would refer us to their colleagues outside of Singapore, which we really didn't get too much connection with or feedback from. And the conferences that we had in Singapore, we didn't really meet people who could be first adopters of an R&D service. It wasn't something that was typical for Singapore, and in the way that is more typical for the UK, which has a lot of consultancies. Furthermore, there were no pilot manufacturing lines. So when you talk with manufacturers about setting up a nanomaterial production facility at their site, it's not something that they would typically do. So there's no really pilot environment for producing new materials. And the supply chain was slow for rapid development. So if what we're offering is a rapid development platform, we need to get our chemicals and consumables and everything very quickly. And if you have a system in which you're getting your equipment and consumables and even maintenance a month or 2 months after you've placed a purchase order, then that's actually going to be a major roadblock for sort of a contract R&D. So, this required some major thinking. And the second business model we came up was much more traditional. So building upon our POC project, we decided, what if we just manufacture additives, so antimicrobial additives for paint and paint precursor producers. So there are lots of paint companies in Singapore, a lot of paint is used in Southeast Asia. What if we supply them with antimicrobial additives? So if we go back to the map, actually industry, seemed fairly supportive of this, even even in the larger MNCs that had some work here, if we were to just be a supplier of materials to them, because what they do here is they formulate products and then produce them for the local market. However, and we didn't see any, really roadblocks from regulators or funding bodies, but we did see two sort of gaps that prevented that have prevented manufacturing of these additives. So, firstly, COVID delays trials. If we're going to trial out new paint, you need painters to coat walls, and you need people to experiment and observe these walls in a realistic environment. And with the recent COVID pandemic, that was just impossible. So, and trials have still been sort of on hold due to that. And you still have this problem of a pilot line. So to manufacture within Singapore, or at least near Singapore, you need to have some sort of facility that will let you generate samples, 100 up to 100 kg or ton scale, so that people can test them on large scales. But I think this is a more solvable problem. So we've applied for funding from the NRF to basically help us through this period and to help us build a pilot line, not just for the manufacturing of additives, but potentially in the future, we could use this as a basis for manufacturing other sorts of materials. So that's sort of how we shifted models based on the ecosystem that we had explored. But what I want to know is that we didn't actually, in the research institute, researchers, tech transfer offices, they all thought, it was a great idea to have this R&D, contract R&D work. When we talked to the Singapore government or the funding bodies, there was no issue there either. But it's only when we started exploring that external sphere, industry, that we really started discovering the gaps that exist, and that's how we could adjust our business model, which is pretty crucial to further commercializing the technology. Okay. So if you have any questions, please feel free to share them now or in the chat, or if you want, we can go straight into a discussion. And probably for the discussion, it would be best to have the breakout room. Yeah, I guess if you have any questions, I'm free to answer those right now. So you can either just raise your hand and Luis can show it, or you can send them in the chat.
There's a question in the chat now. Someone has asked, how easy was it to get the IP from Create/NRF?
So, I mean, IP is still in Cambridge. So it's basically discussing licensing agreements. I think part of it is showing the tech transfer offices the trajectory that you have for commercialization and showing them that you have funding. I mean, they're pretty flexible in how much you have to pay and the payment deadlines, but you need to really have concrete discussions with them on how you're going to commercialize it. So it's not like they'll just give you it right away. You have to really do your homework before that. And right now we're still not licensing the IP yet. We're still sort of working in the university sphere, and our plan is to start licensing once we actually start producing and for a profit this material.
We've had another question about, Nick, how did you feel personally when you were setting up your company? And the person who's asking has referred to a feeling of risk or excitement as you're going through that process. Can you comment on that?
Oh yeah, definitely lots of risk and lots of excitement. I mean, um, actually, to be honest, the reason why we finally incorporated was so that we could apply for grant applications in the UK that would, um, allow us to get more funding. So it was sort of like we founded the company officially just as a means to keep it going forward. So it was at a critical point where it was like sort of, it made sense, like this is what we have to do now. I think, as I don't really have any plans to be an academic or a professor. So for me, I'm trying to already get outside of that sphere. But if you want to be a professor, yeah, then it would take away some of your time from writing papers and generating that reputation. So it is riskier in that regard. So I've pretty much had to let go of that option of being a professor.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Another question from Cambridge. Have there been influences to the BM choice from the finance sphere? I'm not exactly sure what BM means. Do you know what that means?
Oh, business model.
Ah, business model. Thank you. Yeah. So have there been influences to the business model from the finance sphere?
From the finance sphere. So yes and no. I guess from the finance sphere or the funding sphere, they always want to see sort of high growth, high return of investment business models. And we've heard in the past, consultancy is not a great, it's not huge growth, but it can be high profit sometimes. Yeah, in a way, it does influence. But like I said, we're trying to look at government funding, which is it's different than private funding. So the government funders will sort of be more likely to support risky science projects than VCs. VCs, I think, want to see more things that are closer to reality. So when I've been formulating my business model, it's almost like forming a business model that can evolve, right? So one concept is to start as a consultancy, build a capital, and evolve into a manufacturing business model. So having a flexible assumption of what your model will be helps out in that regard.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Nick. And another question also on the business model. Someone has asked, what would need to change for you to insist on the R&D contract business model?
So the question is, what would I need to do to insist?
Yeah, so I think they're asking what would need to change in terms of perhaps the ecosystem, or perhaps, I'm not sure exactly what would need to change, but for you to use that R&D contract business model instead.
So if we're going to do it in Singapore, I think local companies need to be more risky, and they need to develop entirely new products. So this is just in my field. So this is just material science. I don't find a lot of companies, like established companies within Singapore, creating entirely new products. This is not like, I'm not just, this is as opposed to like an adaptation of an existing product. So like an example would be like Grab is sort of an adaptation of Uber for the local market, right? It's not an entirely new product. It's not entirely new innovation. So I would say, if local companies started being more, less risk averse and putting more capital into that, then it would help. I'm not saying that they should do that just because it's good for them. I'm just saying that, for that sort of business model to happen, that would need to take place. And yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Nick. And just one more. someone from Smart who's asked whether incorporating your company allows you to apply for grants in Singapore as well. They've also asked which of the Singapore grants that you are applying for, or maybe the ones that you did apply for, if if you'd already done that and are no longer doing so.
Yeah, so with Cambridge, I'm still working with the University of Cambridge. So we've applied through the CGF as a sort of a research fund. So it doesn't go directly to Accelerated Materials, but Accelerated Materials can work with Cambridge to develop some core technology and use the developmental space that we fund through that work. So in that way we can access public funding in Singapore. As well, there's some there's a Eureka fund that's sort of a international fund for companies and universities in different countries to collaborate. That's another fund that we can apply for. I think it's a bit later than seed stage, so it'd be better to have seed funding first before going for that. And you know, we are planning to start things in Singapore as well. So to have a company registered within Singapore, and in that way we can start applying for Singaporean public funding. And especially if we have Singaporeans working with us, then they can also apply for entrepreneurship funding.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. No more questions for now. Did you want to go into breakout rooms now, because I've got some ready to go? Well, we've got 14 people back, which, yeah, I think that's everybody actually. Great, so Nick, if you're there, do you want to wrap up unless there's anything, do we want to go around and see people's insights? I know we've just got a couple of minutes left, so yeah, I'll let you decide how you want to finish up.
Yeah, I think, you know, if anyone wants to bring up some feedback right now, I think we only have a few minutes left, but perhaps like some suggestions for future things, talks or resources you want to see. Maybe, you know, does anyone have any suggestions on those lines?
And that includes if there's a particular like guest speaker that you would like us to invite, we can invite them on your behalf. Yeah, we'd be happy to do that. Or if there's someone in your Create Centre who you think would be really great for us to hear from, you can also suggest them as well.
Yeah, and you can also just email the suggestions as well. And I think one thing that could help is maybe we can form a LinkedIn group or some sort of social media group for everyone to connect on, since we do have outside people outside CARES, not outside people, joining. So I can create a LinkedIn page for that, and maybe people can network and ask questions and explore different ideas and, you know, get all those good things that they don't have right now.
That's
so,
a great idea, Nick.
Yeah. I guess I can finish by thanking everyone for joining this talk. I hope it was a good experience and not a boring seminar. And if, you know, I think we're holding these bi-weekly, so you should receive an email inviting you to the next talk. I hope that you attend and contribute a lot more, because this is all about creating a network and a community to support each other. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.